morning. I'm Nancy from Black Sheep Knitting in Needham, Massachusetts. We're a local yarn shop, and we have a lot of yarn. Today I thought would be a good time to sort of reiterate some of my tips and tricks that I've talked about in the past. We all strive to be better knitters, including me. I can sometimes be a little sloppy if I'm not paying attention. So I thought I would just give you some tips that I think about when I want to be a better knitter and when I want to make something without mistakes. So one of the things that I think you should get in the habit of doing is knitting a little bit every day. I often have people we have classes that meet once a week here, and people come in and say, oh, I haven't touched this for a week. Where am I? Or can you help me find where I am? Well, you can always find 5 minutes in your day, and that may seem ridiculous, but it helps. It gives your hands some muscle memory and reminds your hands how you knit and how you like to knit. So if you knit a little bit every day, I knit a lot every day, I have to confess. In part I do it because I love doing it and I love making things. I've always loved making things. But I also do it because I knit things for the shop and I want people to see what I'm knitting, and I knit samples for the shop. So I knit quite a lot, but that's my profession. I do think that if you really think about it, you can find 5 minutes or 10 minutes. You know, get up 10 minutes earlier and get a cup of coffee and sit down and knit for 10 minutes before you go to work or go about your day. One thing that I found is helpful to me in particular is to knit the same way, knit every stitch the same way. And if you look, as I look at, we have an awful lot of knitters that are just exquisite knitters. Every stitch is even, and I tend not to be that way because I'm a little bit sloppy, because I'm hurrying or whatever. But when I really concentrate and think, I want this piece to look really professional, so I make sure that I'm knitting my stitches the same way with the same amount of tension every stitch. And if, as I've watched people, and I watch a lot of people knit, the people that knit really beautifully are those people that do the same thing. Has nothing to do with speed. You can knit really fast and be a perfect knitter, or you can knit very slowly. But the key is to knit the same way with the same tension. So you have to always be throwing your yarn, or if you're picking, if you're doing continental stitch, you want to be doing it the same all the time. Another thing that I think is important, don't stop in the middle of a row when you're knitting. If you have to put, and you've heard people say just one more stitch, I just have to finish the row. There's a reason for that. You want to get all the way across the row. Number one, you want to remember where you are so you could write down, check off that you did that row so you'll know. You also, some people make the mistake of picking their knitting up in the middle of a row and going in the wrong direction. Your knitting, when you pick it up, your yarn should always be on the right-hand side if you're in the middle of a row. If you're starting a new row, your working yarn will be over here in your left needle because you're going to start knitting with that. So it's a good idea, so you don't get confused, don't stop in the middle of the row. Another helpful hint is when you're changing yarn from one ball to the next, try not to do that in the middle of a row, because you can tweak it and pull the ends and stuff to get it right, but it's a pain in the neck. So if you start at the end of a row, at the beginning of the row, start with a new ball of yarn, you'll be much better off. Now you might ask, well, how do I know how much yarn I have left? A good rule of thumb is, if you're just doing straight like stockinette, if you take what yarn you have left and measure it 3 times the length of your row of 3 rows, that should be enough to get you back across the row. Now if you're doing something with cables or bobbles, you might want to count on 4 times because those things eat up more yarn. Or if you're doing straight garter stitch uses up more yarn than stockinette. And by garter stitch, I mean knitting every row. Another thing that makes you a better knitter is to every yard or every inch or so, you want to go back and look at your knitting. I like to do it after every row, but some people don't. But I had an instance where someone had knit this much and only then realized that the pattern was incorrect. Well, if you look right away and see that you're doing what you're supposed to be doing, and it looks the way, and you can tell if it looks the way it should by looking at the picture of your pattern. Don't just keep knitting and saying, yeah, I'm doing what the pattern tells me, but you might have misunderstood the pattern. So sometimes a pattern will tell you to do work as established in such and such a stitch. Read that whole sentence and make sure you understand what they're telling you. And that brings up another hint for being a really good knitter. Some people say you should read all the way through the pattern. I generally skim through the pattern to see which parts come when, if I start with the yoke and then I do sleeves or do, knit from the bottom up or knit from the top down. I try to find out all that information ahead of time. But you should always read, and I've said this over and over again, but I can't tell you how many people I have to remind them, did you read the notes? Did you read what it tells you to do? And really, if you have trouble, read it out loud to yourself or read it to have somebody read it to you so that you understand what it is they're telling you to do. And for heaven's sakes, don't make stuff up. I can't tell you how many times I've talked to people who say, well, then I should do da-da-da. No, you're making it up. You don't make it up. Only do what the pattern tells you. And usually, if it's a good pattern, it will give you good advice and good instructions, but only if you read. And make sure you read from punctuation mark to punctuation mark. So if you read directions on a row will be, for instance, purl 1, comma, knit 2 together, purl 2, comma, and then on to the next. But make sure you read those very carefully. And when something is within brackets, that usually means that you're going to repeat it some amount of time. It may say, I saw one yesterday that it was purl 1, comma, then within brackets it was knit 1, purl 1, and then it said until the last stitch. Then it said purl 1 or something. So that means you're going to repeat what was within the brackets. Knit 1, purl 1 all the way across the row. Doesn't mean you repeat that first knit 1 or purl 1. It's only from the beginning to a comma and it within those brackets. I hope I'm making that clear. Another good idea is to make notes about what you did. You can make notes on a separate notepad, or you can make a copy of your pattern and just mark it up as you do it. I like to go through sometimes. First of all, the first thing you should do is circle the size that you're doing, because even I have gotten partway through a pattern and forgotten what size I'm doing, and I made a big mistake, as you'll remember, those of you who watch these videos. I did make a big mistake I normally do the third size over, and I was doing a size 1 because I was using a heavier yarn, so it was going to make the pattern bigger, so I went down a size. I forgot that and then followed the instructions for the third size. So make sure and you can do that all the way through the pattern, go through and circle all the numbers for whatever size it is that you chose. Always keep your ball bands, the tags. People come in with a bit of yarn and say, can you tell me what this is? Well, we're not geniuses. We're smart and we know a lot about knitting, but sometimes we can't identify a yarn. if you've kept your ball band, and the best way to do it is to put it inside, we have our pattern, and you put it in a plastic sleeve, stick the ball band of the yarns that you're using in there, the tags. So then you'll know, and keep the pattern. Don't immediately throw them out. That's kind of, some people are neat freaks, and I'm not, so I don't throw anything out, sadly. But you should keep the ball bands. Also, you can write down how many skeins you used. Then that will be within your notes. And if you alter a pattern, if you alter the dimension from your underarm to where the sweater, or whatever you're making, sweater, vest, whatever, where you want to bind off and where you want that to fall. If you write that down, that's a good idea. Another really good idea is to get your measurements. Have somebody measure you, measure around the widest part of your bust, measure your hips, measure from underarm to your wrist, measure to 3/4 length, measure how you like from the underarm to where you want it to fall. Put those statistics in your phone, and your notes. So then you'll always have it. So you'll always know. You don't have to keep measuring yourself. Another thing, this is one of my sort of bugaboos when people come in and either come to class or come in for help, and they come in without any tools. Take your tools with you. Take your little pouch or whatever you use to keep your tool, your measuring tape, your little scissors, your stitch markers, your pins for putting things together, your tapestry needle. Keep all of those along with your knitting all the time. And you can put them in a little small pouch. They're not heavy. Another tip, somebody asked me today, can you take your needles on an airplane? And I know everybody's getting ready to travel and go places this summer. Yes, you can take your needles. In the continental United States, well, even in, anywhere in the U.S. and North America, as far as I know, you can. Central America is a different story, and many people have had their needles confiscated coming out of Mexico into the U.S. Another place is Australia. They will take your needles coming out of Australia. And I once had somebody try to take my needles in Ethiopia, but I convinced them not to. And I honestly don't know about South America. Most of Europe, I've had no problem. Someone just told me that Czechoslovakia could be a problem. So find that out if you can ahead of time, but don't let anybody in the U.S. tell you can't take your needles. Yes, you can. Don't take scissors. You can take the folding scissors if you want, or we have a little disc that has notches in it that you can cut your yarn. And I just keep that in my wallet with all my change, so I always have it, so you can always cut your yarn. Let's see if I've forgotten anything. If you have a new technique that you're doing in your pattern, so if you've read through, or you've read your notes in the beginning, you might want to knit yourself a little swatch or keep your gauge swatch and practice that new technique on that so that you understand and it looks the way it's supposed to look. Because you can do it, you could be interpreting it the wrong way, and then if you look at your pattern and look at what you did, they're not the same, then maybe you need to get a little help. Another little tip, your cast on edge and your bind off edge. Those edges, and if you've ever looked at a cast on edge, even you can see it on the swatch and it curls, it has kind of a curl to it. That probably means it's too tight. What your cast on edge and your bind off edge should have the same elasticity as your knitting. They shouldn't be tighter and they shouldn't be looser. So if you're casting on and you get that curl, that means you're casting on too tight. One thing you could try to do is cast on with a larger needle. Some people cast on to 2 needles held together. I don't do either of those things. I just make sure that I cast on not loosely. I guess I've just figured it out through experience of how to get it just right. And if you get knitting that first row and your bottom looks sloppy or it's too tight with a curl, start again. And again, when you get to the end and you're binding off, you want to make sure you don't bind off too tightly, and that happens with a lot of people, including me. I just finished a sock and I went to try it on, and it's fine, but it could have been, the top could have been a little bit looser. So you really want it to feel like the fabric that you have knit, so that it doesn't, at the top it could also curl the other way. So I think that that's probably all I have to say for today. It's a gorgeous day here. I hope on Saturday when you see this, you're enjoying some relaxing time for the holiday weekend, and that you give yourself some time to knit. So enjoy, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.